All right, guys, we are so happy now to be joined by Michael Peterson, friend of the show who's been on with us before. Michael, how you doing today, man?
Can't complain. It's rainy outside, but feels good. I like the warm weather. I'm in Iowa, if you guys don't know, so it's just nice that it's not snowing anymore.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I can't imagine it snowing in March still. I think that's a little crazy to me, being in California, but it is what it is. So let's start with this. Obviously the first week of free agency has come and gone for the Chargers and everybody else. And I think the most notable decision that they had to make was with Hunter Henry and how they would potentially go about replacing him if they were to lose out on him. What did you make of them deciding not to? I mean, we don't know if they offered him or what they offered him, but what did you make of his decision to leave to New England and the Chargers' decision to replace him with Jared Cook?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, I wrote up something today that just kind of talked about how it looks like Tom Telesco's mantra of draft, develop, re-sign is kind of taking a little bit of a hit. Most notably, I talked about initially I thought Hunter Henry, it was a foregone conclusion that he would return. I feel like this team was, made fans so used to maybe doing maybe the not so smart move if it meant bringing back a guy that was a good player that they drafted, that helped them succeed as a team. And I think you can say that about Hunter Henry, but at the end of the day, realizing where that money was going to come from and what it would stop the Chargers from doing, I think it really made them kind of think twice about bringing back a guy who's not only beloved by his team, the fans, and everyone that is involved with the Chargers loves Hunter Henry. But I think the second that Jonnu Smith deal came out, where he was making, I think it was 12 million on the dot, uh, forced the Chargers' hand. I thought if the Chargers could get him around 10, a little bit over 10 million per year, that'd be good for Henry, just who he is, what he's done for the team, track record, and also adding in his injury history. I thought that'd be a fair
Right.
deal. But at the end of the day, like you said, he is a Patriot now, and what that's allowed the Chargers to do is build their offensive line like we've seen. Filer, Lindsley, Abushi as well. These are great moves, I think. They're not, besides Lindsley, they're not super splashy, but I think they're the right guys. I think they're for the right money as well. And when you think about what a Hunter Henry deal would have done to the Chargers, I don't think we'd have anyone near the people that we've brought in, right? I think Lindsley happens. But then that's kind of it. I think maybe they're forced to sign one of their re-sign like a Lamp or a Tevy or something like that. So at the end of the day, it's tough, but I think they did make the right move in the end.
Right. And I remember last year there was sort of discussion. I think Daniel Popper reported like prior to the pandemic, they were kind of like working on an extension, and then pandemic happens and doesn't get done. Now he's a Patriot. So I wonder, how much it was 182.5, the cap room. And so instead of 200, you would have had an extra 17.5 million to work with. So I wonder how much that affected it. But are there any free agent signings that the Chargers made that or the Chargers didn't make that you think could have been good value?
I think, off the top of my head, let's just go positional wise. I think there could have been a corner signing potentially, not a deal like what Adoree Jackson got for from the Giants, right? Not a
Ridiculous.
deal where they're paying anyone more than what they just re-signed Michael Davis to. But I think, one name that I saw come across my screen was Steven Nelson, that he got released, terminated by the Steelers, and the guy's been in the league for 6 years, so he's not super old, still a veteran though. 3 interceptions over the last 2 seasons, 2 last year. Was solid, played 30 of 30 games that he played in with the Steelers. So, I mean, the health is still there, only missed 2 games, across 2 seasons. You look at a guy like that who may not have a big market and who you can maybe get for a year or two, maybe averaging, 7.5 million, something like that. Kevin King, you saw from the Packers, just got the 1 year deal for 6 million. And Kevin King's nothing special, but he's just a starting cornerback, not a cornerback one, your main shutdown guy, but just a guy who's going to start 2, maybe 3 as your third cornerback. And those guys are worth, around 6-7 million. So I think like a deal like Steven Nelson would be great. But them not having signed a cornerback up to this point is a little questionable. I do expect them to address it in the draft, but I would like to see them maybe make one move for a veteran guy.
Yeah, I would have loved to see them, target a cheap veteran. Malcolm Butler is still out there. I think that could make some sense. I would be in favor of Steven Nelson for sure. And then today, like right before we were coming on, it happened to come out that J.C. Horn has met with the Chargers twice. He shares an agent with Derwin James, and he has a good connection with Derek Ainsley. Um, what would you make? I think because we've always been aboard the offensive line at 13 train. I think that is the smart decision for this franchise. But what would you make if they took J.C. Horn at 13? Or I don't think Patrick Surtain would be there, but in general, what would you think if they took a cornerback at 13 instead of an offensive lineman?
Uh, what that would tell me is they're comfortable with potentially finishing out or rounding out this offensive line with an offensive lineman on day 2 or even later. I don't think they sign a 4th offensive lineman in free agency. Maybe if literally no one else resigns any of their depth pieces behind even Lamb. Um, but it tells me where the priorities lie. It tells me that Staley, he showed us that he wanted to prioritize the offensive line, so we made 3 signings. But to spend that first round pick, right, your coveted pick, your top pick, on a position that isn't viewed as the biggest need on the team, at least by the majority of people, it tells me that he thinks the secondary does need that much more help. And if you look at that, the depth chart, you're looking at Chris Harris, Michael Davis, and then Brandon Faison, who is definitely not your team's 3rd best cornerback. And knowing how the NFL is today with the spread out offenses, teams are running base nickel defense. You just need 3 good corners, or else you're going to be a struggling defense. So they're either going to sign one in free agency, or they're going to have to take one with one of their first 3 picks. But I wouldn't be that surprised, only because recently with a lot of the pro days happening, we're finding out about a lot of these, day 2 offensive tackles, like Spencer Brown, from Northern Iowa, just had a heck of a pro day. You guys seen this at 6'8". I think he had a sub 6'8" 3-cone or something like that, or at least a sub 7 for sure. I mean, this is a true 6'8" man. I think 311 pounds, being able to move with that type of bend. And while that's not a direct transition drill to show you on-field skill for an offensive lineman, it's insane athleticism. And a lot of those guys are who teams want to bet on. They can coach up some of the things, but God-given talent and physicality and athletic ability aren't things that are grown on trees. And 6'8" who moves like that isn't. So if they do take a corner again in the first round, it tells me that they're comfortable with some of these freak athletes that aren't being talked about as first round linemen.
Yeah, and what do you kind of make of stock up, stock down in terms of draft positions, right? Because you figure, right, Hunter Henry leaves and they get Jared Cook, but that's kind of a stopgap option at this point. So, do you go draft a tight end? So it seems like the need for tight end has increased. Do you think there's any other positions that have gotten more important or less important in the draft for the Chargers?
So I think tight end's a tricky group, because you're right. They let go of a great young talent at the position in Hunter Henry, and they brought in a veteran 33-year-old Jared Cook. But they did do the right thing. I'm so glad that they re-signed Steven Anderson. He's still, off the top of my head, 27, 28, so he's not super old, kind of in a sweet spot for his career, and showed a lot of potential, at least during his limited snaps in 2020. And then you got Donald Parham, who, I go back and watch some of his touchdowns. I watched the touchdown from the final game against the Chiefs, where he kind of stuck his foot on the ground and kind of laid this defender past him, and he walked into the end zone, essentially. Like, to me, that is natural nuance and ability at the position. Like, you don't coach players to be aware of how a defender's running at you and taking into account his speed, his angle, and understanding, do you have enough time to snag the ball like this, stop on a dime to make that play happen. I just think it's such a natural thing. So in general, I think Parham's got tons of talent that hasn't even been tapped yet. And I'd like to see him get the opportunity to produce in this offense going forward. But can I 100% say that Brandon Staley and Tom Telesco are confident in the tight ends they have behind Cook, who, like you said, is a stopgap tight end? I don't think so. I think they will draft a tight end in this year's draft, but I'd be surprised if it's anywhere above the 4th round. I think, my top 3 positions are offensive line, corner, and an edge rusher to pair opposite Bosa. So, but I mean, an early day 3 tight end, maybe in the 3rd round, if they really have a talent that falls, then maybe. But for sure, I think tight end kind of moved around a little bit, but I think it's settling as still a middling positional need.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at this group because you have, three really, potential high-end receiving options, but Cook doesn't block literally at all. And Parham, we heard all training camp that he needs to improve as a blocker, and Steven Anderson, it's pretty miserable blocker himself. So they'll have to add a blocker and hopefully, be able to add a guy who can have some upside as a receiver as well. I'm glad you mentioned the edge rusher. That's where I wanted to go next because people on Twitter seem to be kind of split on the chances and the possibilities that come with Uchenna Nwosu being the starter opposite of Joey Bosa. Obviously, he's been an effective player. It's just been the health. Like we haven't really seen him be able to take on a full workload yet. So where do you stand with Nwosu? And you mentioned potentially taking another edge rusher in the third round. Do you think that Nwosu and his potential is good enough to deter them from adding a high-end player in the first 3 rounds?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think during the 2020 season, there was a lot of frustration stemming from the lack of playing time for Nwosu. As the teams, honestly, if you look at least on paper, he was the second best pass rusher on the team.
Yeah.
People can say what they want about Melvin Ingram, who he is, what he does for the defense that doesn't get put down on paper, it doesn't get recorded, but 0 sacks and 0 tackles for loss is still a stat. You still have to acknowledge it, right? Like he played 7 games, he was throttled by injuries, which is a huge bummer. But he wasn't the player that we all wanted him to be. So Nwosu, to me, was given a prime opportunity to be thrust into that position to show what he can do. And I mean, he despite barely starting, I think he maybe started 3 or 4 games, had 3.5 sacks, still second on the team. But instead, week after week, all of a sudden it was Jerry Tillery at end. And I think that was a move because they felt Nwosu couldn't play the run nearly as well. And they wanted a bigger body out there to set the edge. And then it was Isaac Rochelle, who is consistently just fine, but that doesn't get the job done. He wasn't making splash plays, and there were times he was getting washed in the run game as well. So I think if they were playing those two ahead of Nwosu that consistently, that tells us that maybe Nwosu really is a liability when trying to stop the run, which would be a huge bummer, and it would definitely limit his chances of being the starting outside linebacker in Brandon Staley's defense, potentially playing up on the line. Like Leonard Floyd would, Samson Ebukam, one of those guys. So we'll see, but we look at the third round edge rushers I really like, and I think they fit more of the mold that Staley wants at that position, a lot taller, longer, with a better skill set combination of speed and power, and guys like Washington's Joe Tryon, Jordan Smith, I think from UAB, the massive 6'7" guy. These are guys who kind of fit more of the profile of Leonard Floyd. I mean, Nwosu's shown a lot. It's just if we can take what the past coaching staff is making us think about Nwosu, like just their actions to not start him does speak volumes about who he potentially is as a player, and whether we listen or not, will depend on his future. But I think he deserves the shot. And if it still doesn't work out with a staff that's supposed to be able to fix almost any defensive player, at least the way we hold him up on this pedestal, then I think maybe Nwosu is not the player that a lot of us think he is.
Right. And, you talk about kind of going offensive tackle in probably the first round, quarterback second round. If you're going cornerback second round, who are some of the guys that you would really like sort of in that spot?
So this is a position that I don't do a ton of work on in the off season. I try to figure out an idea of who kind of the top 5 or 6 guys are. It seems like once the bandwagon kept rolling for Asante Samuel Jr. is when, especially Tyler and other people are like, he's not going to be there at 47. And the more I watch him, the more I kind of dived into it. I agree. I think there's a legacy thing there with who his dad is. Just his style of play, I think, is extremely versatile. Again, in a NFL where nickel cornerbacks and guys who can play outside, inside versatility becomes much more important, and Samuel is that type of guy. I think, Steven, you're the big J.C. Horn guy, right?
Yeah, he's my number 1 guy. We're all split. I don't know how Tyler's ranking has changed with Caleb Farley's back surgery going on, but right now Alex has Surtain, I have Horn, and Tyler has Farley, so we're all mixed right now.
Yeah, so I mean, I like Caleb Farley a lot. He's obviously a first round guy, not going to be the top of the second. When I try to consider who's probably going to go in the first round on top of what other positions are probably going to see runs early on. I mean, obviously there's quarterback. I think the more we find out about some of these offensive linemen, who tackles and guards, honestly, as these pro days come by, they're showing off immense athleticism. So guys who you probably thought were going to be their linemen top of day 2 are probably going to get into day 1 as well. And so you got to think some of these corners fall a little bit. And I like Jason Horn, but I think he's probably maybe the guy I think will be available at the top of the second round. I do like him a lot. I like his physicality. I think after watching a lot of the secondary over the past few seasons, again, tackling, sure tacklers are a big thing that this defense has been missing. And that's why I like a guy like Horn. I think if they're going to land any of the top 5 or 6 corners in this draft, I like Horn a ton at 47 if he does fall.
So I got to ask you one question. Would you, I got to put a gun to your head here. Would you take Horn or Surtain? We have to settle this.
Like this is a trick question.
No, it's something we have to settle this beef between me and Steven. So I'm gonna ask every person who comes on the show now.
This is where I wish I had done a lot more work on these guys. So brand name tells me Surtain. One of my good buddies, so Kyle Posey, who covers the Niners for us here at SB Nation, just put out a bunch of thoughts on Surtain that is his apparent cornerback 5, and he's not the biggest fan about Surtain. Does not think he's the big talent that everyone thinks he is. Makes me kind of falter a little bit on like my confidence on if I think Surtain or Horn is good. If they're both available, however, I do think I may go Surtain. I like his blend of athleticism with his size. I just think he's more prototypical right now for the NFL. But I could easily eat my words on making that decision because of just who Horn is and what I think he can provide for a defense.
Yeah, my biggest thing with Horn has always been, I think his athleticism matches up, his tackling ability, like you mentioned, matches up. But, I mean, he's got the most swagger of the cornerbacks, and I think that's so important for the position. Being able to have that confidence of just, I'm going to be put on an island, coach. You leave me alone. I'll do my thing. I'll shut down this side of the field. And the Chargers had that in Casey Hayward. And as much as I like Michael Davis, I don't know if Michael Davis is going to be able to do that. So we'll wrap it up with this one. The Chargers, I think, have close to $15 million in cap space left remaining after, accounting for the draft picks and things like that. You mentioned Steven Nelson, but do you think there are any other players out there that call your attention that you think would, put a pretty bow on this free agency class for the Chargers?
I think if I had to name a free agent that I would like to see them bring in, again, specifics are kind of passing me by, but I would love to see them bring in an edge rusher. I think not, and it doesn't have to be a guy that starts immediately. I think bringing in the guy who's kind of been there, maybe has some familiarity for within a Fangio Staley defense, I think is absolutely huge. Just some of the kind of guys, some of the younger guys along, because this defense still is fairly young. Tillery, Jones, Nwosu, again, is young, is going into his 4th year, I believe, but he hasn't played a ton, right? So I would like one of these veteran edge rushers to come through. I don't have a list in front of me, or else I'd probably find one real quick and pick one out. But edge rusher, such a critical position. And there are some really peculiar names in the draft, especially, rounds 1 through 3. It's not like super, super top heavy. There's not one guy who's obviously godlike. A lot of analysts have talked about their frustration trying to figure out and rank these edge rushers. So I think with that in mind as well, knowing that there's no surefire guys, there's just a lot of potential. I'd like to bring in a veteran guy. I don't think he fits the scheme, but I think of an Adrian Claiborne, who I know personally from Iowa, playing there, who has moved around a ton, but it's just he's a decent edge rusher. Yeah. I think that's kind of all they need, right? This isn't a guy who's going to be the star. He's just going to be a guy that when someone needs to take a breath, you're not losing a ton of pass rushing ability. And now that I think about it and kind of look back, the Chargers also haven't had that much. Nwosu has kind of been a good third wheel, right, for this pass rushing tricycle, as I always like to call it, with Bosa and Ingram. But when Ingram kind of started faltering, then you kind of just had Bosa and Nwosu, who wasn't getting enough time, and Ingram, who just wasn't coming through the way we were all used to him coming through, right? His numbers have declined the last 2 years previous, 2020, and then 2020 happened, which was, something that I'd almost like to repress as a Chargers fan, because it's tough to see a guy make 14 million and unfortunately not do anything, but you can't help injury and the like that. So sorry for not having a specific, but edge rusher, like just a middling guy who could rotate in, I think is a big deal.
Yeah, I would have liked to see Jeremiah Tauchu. Honestly, I think that would have made a lot of sense too, just from a familiarity standpoint. And Adrian Claiborne, I think, was a good shot as well. So, Michael, thank you for joining us, man. Where can Chargers fans? I assume most of them follow you, but where can they find your work, and what kind of projects do you have coming up in the near future?
Yeah, so if you guys don't follow me on Twitter just yet, it's at Zone Tracks. That's spelled ZONETRACKS. All my work is over at SB Nation's boltsfromtheblue.com. And in terms of work that's coming in the future, I mean, we're revving up to the draft, right? So I'd really like to start diving in, doing more, quick scouting reports and just giving my thoughts on a lot of these guys. It's been busy with free agency and that stuff.
Yeah.
But once the bulk of free agency is gone, and my quota can now be filled with more just solely draft stuff. Just look forward to me finally giving my actual thoughts and findings on these prospects going forward.
Awesome. Well, Chargers fans, go ahead, Alex. Sorry.
I was just gonna say I really liked your 90 and 90 series last year, and I'm happy to see that come back again once the Chargers sign all those undrafted free agents. So yeah, go check out Michael's work.
Yes, 90-90. Now that you mentioned, I guess there's something with some brand name to give you. 90-90 is just it's 90 Chargers in 90 days, and it's also hectic because you need to stay on point with it. But sometimes you do a profile and then the guy just doesn't make the team, or he's cut for whatever reason. So you have to stay on top of and sometimes it's more than 90. If you do some, they leave and then they sign more. So it's just a fun series to kind of dive into each player personally and maybe give you more background on the guy that you didn't know previously. And so you can kind of go into the season feeling a little more accustomed to these players and maybe feeling like you know them better on more of a personal level, which is always good for fandom.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that those articles are fantastic. So Chargers fans, make sure you give him a follow. Keep an eye out for all those work. And Michael, we thank you so much for joining us again today.
Yeah, thanks, guys.